Hello, thank you for joining me on a new training series we're doing for Rainier Hills Photo Club. This first training is on understanding focus points, focus modes, and focus types. I'll also talk about the difference between phase detection autofocus and contrast detection autofocus. I'll touch a little bit on face detection and eye autofocus, and also talk about the difference between focusing in live view and focusing through the viewfinder. Well, let's get started. First, let's talk about the different types of focus. Contrast autofocus is the oldest system. It is also the most precise. This type of autofocus that you get on a point-and-shoot camera, and that's one of the main reasons that people bought a DSLR, because the autofocus on their point-and-shoot camera were so bad. This focus system looks at your sensor and is looking for high contrast areas, and it assumes that if the lines are high contrast, then they're in focus. Phase detection autofocus is newer. It is faster, it's predictive, but it is not as precise as contrast. This autofocus system originally came out on film-based DSLRs or SLRs, and then moved to DSLRs, and it's now included on mirrorless cameras. Phase detection uses a pair of sensors, like our two eyes, in order to see the dimension. Here's how contrast autofocus works. Notice we have a line on the left and a line on the right. The line on the left is out of focus, and therefore the designation space between the black and the white part are not high contrast. It's fuzzy because it's not in focus. The lines on the right, on the other hand, are sharp. It's a very sharp edge between the black and the white, therefore it's in focus. So the camera looks at this, a contrast autofocus camera looks at this. If it doesn't see a high contrast line, a line of pixels that are black right next to a line of pixels that are white instead of a whole row of grays, it moves the lens in one direction or the other. And it looks to see if that contrast line has become more sharp. Is it a higher contrast line? If it's not, it moves maybe the other way. If it's closer than it was, it will probably continue to move the same way. But that's the way it works, is it moves a little bit, it checks it, then it moves it again, checks it again, moves it again, checks it again. As you see, this can take some time. The lens moves back and forth in smaller increments, but this is what we call hunting. This is how phase detection works. Phase detection is a higher end autofocus system that is predictive. So if we look at this picture, we have these buildings in silhouette, and we're put the autofocus point on the top of the building up at the top. And the pair of sensors looks at that, and because they're separated by a little bit of space, it can tell whether or not the two images, the one from the left sensor and the one from the right sensor, are completely lined up or not. In this case, they're not lined up. So what happens? The lens moves a little bit, and the lens moves a little bit in front of the sensor, and now the top of the building is lined up. So that's how phase detection works. Pair of sensors look at the photo, and if it's not in focus, it moves to get in focus. This is a very simplified version of what your camera does, and your camera does it much faster than that. Some cameras can do up to 60 times per second. They can check the autofocus. Now, let's talk about focus points and focus modes, because we need both an understanding of focus points and an understanding of focus modes in order to work our autofocus system properly. First, let's talk about focus points. Your camera has a number of different focus points. You can choose different focus points based upon the main in-focus point is located. First, not all focus points are created equal. In some cameras, especially DSLRs, some of your focus points will be considered cross-type, and other focus points are horizontal or vertical. If we look at the picture that we have on the screen, we can see that this camera has, I think, 9 or 19 autofocus points. And we can see that some of them are vertical and some of them are horizontal. Now, a vertical autofocus point is looking for a horizontal line, and a horizontal autofocus point is looking for a vertical line. And then if we notice right in the center, in front of the girl's face, we've got multiple autofocus points. We have 2 horizontal autofocus points and 2 vertical autofocus points. Therefore, that's what's called a cross type. Sometimes it's not 1 or 2, but a cross type on a DSLR will give you a higher quality autofocus because it's looking for either a vertical or a horizontal line, not one or the other. So what is a focus point? The focus points are the visible part of the focusing sensor and the only place your camera can focus. Your camera will not focus anywhere but part of the scene that is behind one of those autofocus points. The rest of the autofocus system on a DSLR is down in the well of the camera, hidden underneath the mirror. On a mirrorless camera, because it doesn't have a mirror, the autofocus system is built onto the sensor itself. The first autofocus camera had one autofocus point. It was right in the center. And then as things went along, that was about 1985, as things went along, they developed 2, 3, and up high. DSLR's cameras can have upwards of about 51. I'm not sure if any DSLR cameras have more than 51. Mirrorless cameras can have up to 693 or even higher. The Canon EOS R technically has 5,565 autofocus positions. They don't call them points, but you can only control 143 of them. But it does have, and with a mirrorless camera, as you can see, they're spread almost edge to edge. So on the left here we have the Canon 60 Mark II, and it has 45 autofocus points. And notice that they're bunched in the center of the image. They are bunched in the center of the image for a couple of reasons. One is because it's a separate sensor, so it's smaller than the, the actual size of the sensor that records the image. And they put them in the center because they expect that's where you're going to be putting your subject. On a DSLR camera focus pointer, a DSLR has a separate autofocus module. It's behind the mirror. Because of this, it is centered into the view and never out to the edge of the view. On the right side, we have the Sony a7 III. And again, both these cameras were $2,000 entry-level full-frame cameras, so I'm comparing apples to apples here. The Sony has 693 autofocus points that cover 93% of the screen. It can do that because these autofocus points are actually baked into the sensor when the sensor is made. So let's talk about how you change your autofocus points. Your camera may have several different ways to control your autofocus points. With some cameras, you set the control in the menu. You've got to go into the menu. So right here we have this top picture. We can see that you're in this menu and you're choosing, by going up and down, you're choosing what focus area you're going to use. Here in the next picture down, we've got a button, and by pushing this button and rolling a dial, you're able to pick which autofocus point it uses. Your camera may have a joystick that allows you to point around. Your camera may have a touchscreen to allow you to activate what points. So you're able to choose which points you use based on a couple of options. You have to tell it how many points you want to activate. So the first thing you look at is how many points you want to activate. And there's several options. Every camera has at least 3 separate options. The first one allows it to look at all of the points. Now in this picture here, we've got a camera that has 11 autofocus points, and it's activating, looking at all 11, and it's finding the subject that is the highest contrast behind one of the points. I'll talk about that in a moment. You can also tell your camera to only look at the center point. It's called the spot. You can also tell your camera to look at, in some cameras they'll have an area or a zone where it'll have multiple ones, just the ones on the left, just the ones on the right, just the ones on the top or the bottom. Or something that different manufacturers call different things. Sony calls the flexible spot. This allows you to use one or a small series of focus points, and you get to move it around the screen exactly where you want. Notice, I did not say it focuses on what you want. It focuses on the subject that is behind whatever point you're looking at. In this case, we're showing it's looking at all 11 autofocus points. It is going to focus on the highest contrast item that is closest to those behind one of those 11 points. It will not focus on something that is outside. If I were to put something down here in the lower left of this picture off of her shoulder, doesn't matter what it is, it will not focus because this particular camera we're showing does not have a sensor there. So it has to be, your subject has to be behind one of the points that you told it to use. And if you have, in this case, if you're looking at all 11 points, it's going to look at all 11 points. And it is going to find the highest contrast item behind one of those 11 points. In this, that is the closest to the camera. In this case, my thought is it's probably going to focus on her chin, not her eye, because her chin is going to be closer to the camera. Your eyes are sunk in a little bit, your chin's a little bit further out. It's probably going to focus on her chin, even though in the picture it appears that it's focusing on her eye. Let's see how this works. Okay. Now, let me change this. Okay, so what we can see here is we can see the back of this camera, and I'm going to show you how to change the autofocus points. So in this case, I hit the function button, and I pull up focus area. And we have several options. I have wide. In this case, this camera has 567 autofocus points, and it's going to look at all of those in this mode and decide what to focus on. Notice it picks the person at the front because they are higher contrast and they are closer to the subject. I can also pick different focusing areas. In this case, this particular camera has one called the zone. If I pick zone, I can move these around. Notice it's a pretty big area. It's not a small area. It's basically more than a quarter of the image. But I can say, no, I want to focus over here, or no, I want to focus over here. And it will focus in a different location. I also have the option of center. If I put it in center, it will focus in the center. And depending upon where my subject is, that's where it will focus. The next option that I have on this camera is called flexible spot. Flexible spot allows me to shoot talk about autofocus. I need to have this in autofocus. All right, so flexible spot, I have some options. With flexible spot, I can choose large, small, or medium. So if I'm in medium, notice the icon there. I can focus on my subject here. I can move it, again, I can move it with this joystick. In this case, I can actually move it with touchscreen. Okay, that's flexible spot medium. There's also flexible spot large. Notice it is larger now. And there's flexible spot small. We also have, in this case, something called expand flexible spot. What that is that looks at one pixel in the middle, and then it looks at the 9 surrounding pixels because they think if it's going to move, it's going to be to one of those. So if I turn that, notice that looks a little different. And that's how that works. We also have other options. Change this. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now I've got other options where I actually have tracking. In this particular case, this camera will track depending upon your autofocus. So I can track depending upon my flexible spot. would track that, and if the subject were moving backwards or forwards, it would focus on that as well. All right, so that's focus points. Now let's talk about focus modes. Okay, let's now talk about focus modes. How focus points work with focus modes. Once you select what points your camera will use, then you must tell the camera how to use those points to achieve correct autofocus. You do this by using what are called focus modes. These modes work differently to achieve correct autofocus. Every camera has at least 3 autofocus modes. Just like with autofocus point selection, there are several ways of controlling them. Some cameras have dedicated buttons, some cameras use the menu, and others have a touchscreen capability. So let's talk about the different types of focus modes. This is how your camera will achieve focus based upon what points you've told it to use. So the first one is called single shot, or Canon cameras and Pentax cameras call it one shot. What that means is when you push down the shutter button, the camera focuses on whatever point you've told it to use. Once it achieves focus, it holds it. And it generally makes a beep unless you've turned that option off in your camera. And it will not focus again until after you take the shot, assuming you have your finger continually pressed down on the shutter. If you release it and then push it again, it restarts. This kind of focus mode works great for stationary objects. The next one is called autofocus continuous, or Canon calls it AI servo. With that focus mode, it looks at whatever point you've told it to use, and it continually updates the autofocusing system based upon what is behind whatever focus point you've told it to use, and as it continues to move. This continually focuses until you take the shot. This is the type of focusing system we generally use for moving objects. Almost everybody's camera has another focus mode called autofocus automatic in Canon and Nikon cameras, or AI focus in Canon cameras. This is autofocus automatic, and the camera tries to decide what focus mode to use based upon whether it sees things moving or not. I'm not a big fan of this mode. In my opinion, it almost always gets it wrong. Be careful, some cameras are defaulted to this mode. And then the other mode you have obviously is manual focusing, where you're in charge of focusing. So again, let's see how this works in real life. All right. Let's fix the camera. Okay. Here again, we're seeing the back of the camera, and we're going to look and see what the focusing mode is. So again, in this case, I could have this put to a button, but I'm just going to use the function. So here is focus modes. Now, if we start at the top, we have autofocus single, or single shot, or one shot. Notice when it focuses, and it beeps, based again, depending upon whatever I've told it to look at. And once it beeps, it holds it. Now, it holds it. Try this. It holds it, and if I put something in front of it, it doesn't make any difference. It's not going to focus on anything else because it's focusing on that. If I let that up and I put something else behind it, now it will focus. A little close for that. This is not a very close focusing lens. Okay. So, as you can see, it focuses on whatever, a single time on the object that you put in front. Let's look at another focusing mode. Autofocus automatic. So again, in this case, we'll do autofocus single. But if it saw things moving, it might switch to autofocus continuous. Again, I'm not a fan of this mode. This is autofocus continuous. So this will continually autofocus on whatever my subject is. So let's say I have it there, and again, I've told it to go to a particular location. Okay, the camera's tracking. Let me tell it to not track. Flexible spot. Okay, so now I have it focusing there, and it sees a new subject, and it will change. Oh, here, I'm taking pictures. Okay, this camera has a thing called DMF, which is autofocus that allows you to change it manually, and then there's manual focus. Now in manual focus, obviously I am in charge of focusing, and it changes exactly how I change it. It doesn't move until I tell it which way to do it. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, here we are again. Now let's talk about, we've talked about focus points, and we've talked about focus modes. Let's talk about something that a lot of newer cameras have, which is face detection and eye autofocus. So remember that your camera, unless it has face detection or eye autofocus, or even if it does and that's turned off, it is going to focus on the highest contrast item that is behind one of the points you've told it to use that is closest to the camera. Those are the things it looks for. It's looking at the points it's looking at, and again, it's either going to focus and hold or continually focus looking at that point, but it is going to look at the highest contrast behind whatever point you've told it to use. If you've only told it to use the center point, as long as nothing gets in front of your subject, you're good to go. But if you're having it look everywhere and something shows up behind one of the other points that's active, that is higher contrast and is closer to the camera, your camera is likely to change autofocus to that. Now, face detection and eye autofocus are some improvements that are fairly recent in cameras. They override the basic autofocus system and try to find and focus on faces. Human faces are a mathematical formula, and that's how it identifies it. There are different versions with different results. Some cameras have eye autofocus and face detection in live view, and some cameras have it through the viewfinder and live view as well. As we learned before, if it is available in live view only, the effectiveness of this feature is based on if the camera has good phase detection autofocus in live view, and we'll talk about that next. If not, the face detection will be mostly useless. On a DSLR camera that has this feature in your viewfinder, not in the live view, but in the viewfinder, it is not the same as a mirrorless camera that has it through the viewfinder. And the reason is, on a mirrorless camera, you're using the full sensor for face detection and the whole power of that. That is the most powerful processor in the camera. On a DSLR camera, that processor, the sensor's hidden behind the shutter and the mirror when you're looking through the viewfinder, so you can't use that processor. So how do they get it to work? Well, there's another processor in there besides the autofocus processor. There's basically three sensor processors in a DSLR. There's the main sensor that records the image. There is the autofocus system, which is built up of multiple sensors. And there's another one. That other sensor is the auto exposure sensor. That looks at your exposure and grades it. Well, they're able to take that auto exposure sensor and have that try to find a face. The problem is that's a much smaller sensor. And so the face detection is not generally as good in that type of a system. If you're interested in a camera that really has good face detection and eye autofocus, you're talking about a mirrorless camera. So here we can see a picture where this subject has a face in the center, and the camera has identified that face and is focusing on it. Here's another example. In this case, it's actually finding the eye. And notice it has found the eye and it's ignoring the hand that's moving in front of it. So that's one of the things with a good eye autofocus system, is it ignores other things. Some systems will allow you to use face detection or eye autofocus only in stills. They won't do eye autofocus in video. Some will. Some only allow you to get eye autofocus when you're set wide, where you're looking all across the entire screen. So that may or may not be as useful. Other systems allow you to put the eye autofocus anywhere you want and still receive the eye. Some systems allow you to choose what eye you focus on. Always the left eye, always the right eye. Other systems generally start off by choosing the closest eye. Some systems now have animal eye autofocus as well. In most cases, you have to turn it on, whether you want to go to animal or human. Now be aware, these systems are evolving. All of this eye autofocus and face detection is pretty new in these cameras. Sony has had eye autofocus since 2013, but it's an awful lot better. It's probably the 5th or 6th or 7th generation, I don't know, since then, and it's much better. Other cameras just got it recently. But they're all evolving and getting better. The animal eye autofocus is not nearly as good as the human eye autofocus. The animal eye autofocus just came out within the last year or so on all cameras. And it's basically the first generation. So animal eye autofocus works, but it isn't nearly as effective as the human eye autofocus. In some systems, eye autofocus only works on AFS, or on one shot. In other cameras, it will track the eye, the autofocus to the eye, ignoring everything else. The eye autofocus system on some cameras is a game changer for portraits. For myself, I only use eye autofocus with tracking anymore, and I shoot in autofocus continuous all the time. The eye autofocus and the autofocus continuous is so good that the time when I used to use autofocus single is pretty much gone. Used to be I would use autofocus single on portraiture because I wasn't moving and the model wasn't moving, pretty much standing still. But the reality is everybody sways a little bit back and forth and they move slightly, and even those slight movements could throw it out of focus. So with the new autofocus systems, as good as they are, and the tracking and the autofocus continuous, and it allows me to shoot at my 85 millimeter lens at f1.4, where that was not the case 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. You had to shoot those lenses at 2.8 or f4 to get a good enough autofocus. So now let's actually do a demonstration of eye autofocus, then we'll come back for this. Okay, let's now look at the camera and show face detection eye autofocus. So the eye autofocus wasn't working quite as well on my white statue, so I have a picture of my grandson. It works just fine on him. Notice that the eye autofocus, it grabs his face, and it goes right there. Again, I can move my point over here, and it'll focus on that. And that's where it stays until it sees the face. And when it sees the face, it will track it from side to side. Let's say I want to turn it to the mode where it's going to look everywhere. So it's going to look the entire wide area. So doesn't see a face. As soon as it sees a face, it says, whoa, face. We want a face. We want to focus on the face. So if I have it set for autofocus continuous wide area, as soon as it sees the face, it's going to focus, coming over here, sees the face, and grabs the face. I can put it on tracking. So I can go tracking, and tracking will then kind of track on that piece of wall over there, and that's where it's going to stay. But if I move it over here to the face, as soon as it sees the face, it will track that side to side. It would track it if the subject were moving backwards or forwards. So that's the way face detection and eye autofocus work. Okay, we're back. Now let's talk about the difference between live view and the viewfinder. So, with a DSLR, your DSLR actually has two completely separate autofocus systems. One autofocus system is behind, your phase detection autofocus system is behind the mirror in the well of the camera. And that's the autofocus system it uses when you're looking through the viewfinder. That is phase detection, so it is fast, it is predictive, and it is the best autofocus system you have. When you put your camera into live view, that mirror goes up. Therefore, the phase detection autofocus system is blind. So now it's recording live off the sensor, and it uses a completely different autofocus system. Now, depending upon the camera, that can either be almost as good, better in some circumstances, than the autofocus system through the viewfinder, or it can be equal, or it can be absolutely significantly worse. Depends on what camera you have. If you have a DSLR and you have a Sony model built since 2006, or if you have a Canon SL2, a Canon 70D, 80D, the new 90D, a 70 Mark II, a 5D Mark IV, a 1D Mark II, or the new 1D Mark III. I believe those are the only models in Canon. If you have that or a Sony, your autofocus in live view is going to be similar, and in some cases maybe even better than through the viewfinder. Unless you have one of these specific cameras, your autofocus in live view is very slow. If you have a Nikon camera, if you have a Pentax camera, if you have a different model of a Canon camera, or you have some other DSLR, your autofocus system in live view is going to be significantly slower. That's because in those other cameras, you only have contrast autofocus in the live view. So if that's the case, I only recommend using live view for things like recording video, which with the DSLR you have to, or macro photography. You know, I'll go to my grandson's baseball games or football games and see people with their DSLRs holding it out in front of them using their live view, and I just know that 95% of those pictures are out of focus. So let's talk about, again, we talked about different types of autofocus systems, phase detection and contrast. Unless you have one of the Canon cameras that is called dual pixel, which is their phase detection built onto the sensor, or you have a Sony camera that is an A55 letter A with 2 digits, 55, 65, 77, 99, or one of the 3 or 4 digits, 6000, A7, those kind of things. Unless you have one of those, your autofocus in live view will be very disappointing. So in live view, those other cameras are using contrast, so they're very slow. Phase detection is the system that a DSLR uses when the viewfinder is used. So that's significantly faster, and if you have a Canon camera that has dual pixel, it's going to be significantly better in live view. Again, some ways the dual pixel can be as good or better than the face detection because it can do things like face detection, where the smaller sensor for the viewfinder can't do those kind of things. So here's, when you put your camera into live view, your DSLR, it raises the mirror, must use the main sensor for focusing, and gives you the live view on the screen. In most cases, this uses CDAF, the slower type autofocusing. The Sony cameras use a hybrid system of PDAF, the phase detection, which is very quick. It gets you close, and then it switches over to the CDAF, so it has both types of sensors on the camera. The Canon has a system called dual pixel. It's in most of their newer cameras, but not every camera. And that uses a system where the actual photo sites, which are the little receptors that receive light, are figured out a way to use those to both record the image, stills or video, as well as measure the focusing distance. and those use the dual pixel when the sensor is open and when you're in live view, and then when the mirror goes down, it uses a traditional PDAF for still photography using the viewfinder. Here's a way that you can do a quick test to see about the speed that your camera has in live view versus the viewfinder. First thing you want to do is put your camera in manual mode and defocus the lens. Then you want to re-engage autofocus, but don't push the button yet. Aim your camera to a high contrast area. I like looking a lot of times up at a ceiling light where you've got both the high contrast area and a dark area right next to each other, a high contrast area. That will help the system focus as fast as it can. Push down the shutter release halfway to engage the autofocus and see how long it takes. Count, see, is it a second, is it 2 seconds, 3 seconds, quarter of a second, whatever. And you can try it a couple of different times to figure out exactly how fast it's going to focus. Now, let's try the exact same thing in live view. So put your camera in manual focus, defocus the lens again, re-engage your autofocus mode, turn live view on, aim your camera to this high contrast area with both, again, the same area you used before, and push down the shutter release button to engage autofocus and see how long it takes to focus. Unless you have a camera with dual pixel or you have a mirrorless camera that has faster phase detection autofocus, if you have a DSLR that is contrast only, it's going to be significantly slower. Sometimes it's a half a second in phase detection, and it might take 2 or 3 or 4 seconds in contrast detection. And that will show you that, and again, this is on a high contrast area, a wall with a picture frame or a window frame, something like that, high contrast area, and that's not moving. So most of the time when you're shooting, you want to shoot moving subjects, or they may be moving. So if it has a hard time focusing on a still high contrast item, think how long it would take to focus on something that's moving. Once you do this, you probably won't be, unless you have the dual pixel in the Canon cameras, or you have a mirrorless camera that has phase detection, you probably won't want to use live view for most situations you would need fast autofocus. It does a great job for macro, it does an okay job for video, but it just doesn't do a fantastic job for moving subjects. So, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or you would like to contact us here at Rainier Hills Photo, we have an email at rainierhillsphoto@gmail.com. Go ahead and contact me if you have any questions about this training, or if you like this type of learning and you would like to suggest other lessons, send us an email and we can see if we can get that going for you. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our meetings soon. Thank you.